There is an interview that Burt Reynolds gave to The Hollywood Reporter in 2011 that almost nobody read carefully enough. He was 75 years old. He was living in a house in Hobe Sound, Florida, that was smaller than the houses he had lived in during the years when he was the most bankable star in the world. He was working in the way that actors work when the work that defined them is gone, doing television guest spots, appearing in films whose budgets were a fraction of the films he had once carried on his name alone, accepting the parts that were offered rather than choosing among the parts that were competing for his attention. He had filed for bankruptcy in 1996. He had lost the ranch in Jupiter, Florida, that he had spent 20 years building into something that represented more than any film set, the life he had imagined for himself. He had lost the restaurant. He had lost most of what the years of extraordinary commercial success had produced in the way of accumulated material wealth. And he had lost it in the specific way that money is lost when the losing of it is not primarily about bad investments, but about a person who was never, at the deepest level of himself, able to fully believe that what he had was real, and therefore could not protect it with the seriousness that protecting real things requires. In the 2011 interview, the journalist asked him about the years that had intervened between the peak of his fame and the present. The question was phrased with the specific gentleness that journalists use with aging stars, not the hard question, not the question that names the decline directly, but the question that gestures toward it in a way that gives the subject the option of engaging with it or deflecting it. Burt Reynolds deflected it. He smiled the way he always smiled, the mustache, the quality of warmth that had been part of the presentation since the beginning, the ease that looked natural and was, in fact, the most practiced thing about him. He made a joke. He said something self-deprecating in the way that he was extraordinarily skilled at being self-deprecating, which was the way of someone who has understood that self-deprecation is a form of control. That if you name your own failure before someone else names it, you retain the power of the naming. And then, for a moment, the smile went somewhere else. Not away entirely, but somewhere else. And he said something that was not a joke and was not self-deprecation and was not the managed version of himself that he had been presenting to journalists for 40 years. He said, "I spent a lot of years being someone I thought people wanted me to be. And by the time I figured out who I actually was, a lot of things were already gone." The journalist moved on. The interview continued. The moment was not flagged in the headline or the pull quotes. It appeared in the body of the piece and passed, as such moments tend to pass, without the weight it deserved. Tonight, my friend, I want to give it the weight it deserves. I want to tell you the whole story of Burt Reynolds, not the story of the mustache and the Trans Am and the Cosmopolitan Centerfold and the films that made him the #1 box office star in the world for 5 consecutive years from 1978 to 1982. That story has been told many times and will be told again. The story I want to tell you is the one underneath that story, the one that the charm and the ease and the spectacular commercial success kept invisible for decades, the one that the decline of the 1980s and 1990s made briefly visible, and that most people interpreted as a story about bad choices and bad luck rather than what it actually was. It was a story about a man who spent 60 years trying to be the person his father wanted him to be, in a world that wanted him to be something else entirely, and who never quite found the version of himself that satisfied either requirement. Come with me. We are going back to the beginning, to Waycross, Georgia, in the year 1936, to a family that was not complicated in its outward structure, a father, a mother, a son, but that was complicated in the specific interior way of families organized around the expectations of a man who has very clear ideas about what a son is for. Burton Leon Reynolds Jr. was born on the 11th of February 1936 in Lansing, Michigan, though the family moved to Riviera Beach, Florida, when he was young. And it is Florida that he always considered his home and his origin. His father was Burt Reynolds Sr., a man who had served in the military and who brought to civilian life the specific quality of authority that military service installs in men who take it seriously. The belief that there are right ways and wrong ways to do things, that the right ways require discipline and the wrong ways are a form of failure, and that the job of a father is to make sure his son understands the difference and chooses accordingly. Burt Sr. was not a cruel father. By every account in the biographies and in Burt Reynolds' own memoir, published in 2015 under the title But Enough About Me, the father was present, attentive, and genuinely invested in his son's development. The investment was real. The love was real. What the love came packaged with was an expectation that was equally real and considerably less flexible than the love. The expectation that the son would become the kind of man the father recognized as a man, which in Burt Sr.'s understanding meant physical toughness, athletic achievement, and the particular stoic competence that his generation understood as the irreducible minimum of male character. The son had the physical capability to meet that expectation. He was a natural athlete. He played football at Palm Beach High School with a quality of instinctive, aggressive commitment that got him noticed by college scouts and eventually produced a football scholarship to Florida State University. This was, in the mid-1950s, the path that Burt Sr. would have designed for his son if he had been given the ability to design it. The son was going to be a football player. The son was going to earn the specific form of respect that athletic success commands in the American South in the 1950s. The path was clear. He was offered a professional contract by the Baltimore Colts. He was on his way. And then he was in a car accident. The accident damaged his knee severely enough that the professional football career became impossible. The injury was not catastrophic in the medical sense. He recovered. He could walk. He could run to a degree. He could function normally in most respects. But he could not play professional football at the level the contract required. The contract was not renewed. The path that had been clear was now gone. He was 21 years old, and the thing he had been building toward since he was old enough to understand what his father wanted from him was no longer available. What was available instead was the thing he had been doing on the side almost accidentally as a way of filling time rather than as a serious professional ambition: acting. He had taken acting classes at Palm Beach Junior College. He had performed in local theater productions. He had found in the process of performing a quality of ease and enjoyment that football had provided in the physical sense, but not in the interior one. When he was on stage, something happened that was different from what happened on the field. On the field, he was performing a version of himself that his father had approved of, that his world expected, that the cultural framework of his time and place recognized and rewarded. On stage, he was performing versions of other people. And in the performing of other people, he had discovered, as many actors discover, and as I have noted in earlier conversations with you about other performers, that the interior life he was not permitted to have, as himself had a container in the character, a place where it could exist without requiring him to defend or explain or manage it. He went to New York. He studied with Lee Strasberg. He worked in theater. He appeared in the original Broadway production of Look We've Come Through in 1961, a play that received mixed reviews and ran briefly, but that put him in front of serious theatrical audiences and in the company of serious theatrical practitioners. He was noticed. The noticing produced television work, and the television work produced more television work, and the more television work eventually produced the screen tests that led to the films. The early films were not distinguished. He was cast in the kinds of roles that the studios assigned to physically attractive young men from the South in the early 1960s. Westerns, action pictures, the specific genre category of the rugged American hero that required from its performer a quality of physical confidence and a quality of apparent ease that Burt Reynolds had in abundance and that he deployed with the professional reliability of a man who has learned to give an audience what it expects from him. But there was something else in him, and the something else was the thing that would eventually make him both more interesting than the roles he was being given and considerably more vulnerable than the image he was constructing. He was funny. Not the deliberate funny of a comedian, not the performing funny of a man who has learned to be funny as a social strategy, but the genuine funny of a man whose intelligence expresses itself in the form of the unexpected observation, the perfectly timed deflection, the specific quality of wit that comes from someone who is paying close attention to the situation he is in and finding in it the absurdity that most people miss. He was also, underneath the ease and the charm and the wit, a person of considerable emotional depth that the professional persona he had developed did not particularly make room for. He felt things more than the mustache and the grin suggested. He cared about his work more than the easy, self-deprecating manner in which he discussed it suggested. He was hurt by things that the man the public knew as Burt Reynolds was supposed to be too cool to be hurt by. The 1972 Cosmopolitan centerfold is the moment that the mythology of Burt Reynolds usually starts from, and it is a reasonable starting point in the sense that it marks the beginning of the specific public persona that the decade would construct and that the decades after would have to manage. He posed for the centerfold at the suggestion of Helen Gurley Brown, who was then the editor of Cosmopolitan, and who understood instinctively that a male nude centerfold in a women's magazine in 1972 was a cultural statement as well as a commercial one, a statement about the changing relationship between women and the objectification of bodies that had traditionally been applied to women by men. He posed with the casual confidence of a man who is entirely comfortable with his own physical presence, and the photograph was received exactly as Brown had intended, as a cultural event that launched a public personality. The personality that launched was not invented, the ease was real, the confidence was real. The willingness to transgress the specific boundaries of what male dignity required in 1972, to laugh at the photograph rather than apologize for it, to meet the cultural moment with a quality of cheerful irreverence, that was genuinely him, or genuinely a part of him. What it was not, and what the photograph and the persona that followed it obscured for many years, was the whole of him. Deliverance came out the same year as The Centerfold. The film, directed by John Borman and based on James Dickey's novel, required from Burt Reynolds something that the persona did not advertise and that the films he had made up to that point had not asked for. A quality of genuine dramatic intensity, of interior engagement with material that was genuinely dark and genuinely threatening. He played Lewis Medlock, the alpha male of the canoe trip, the man whose overconfidence in the wilderness produces the catastrophe that the film documents. It was a role that required him to be both the source of the narrative's energy and the source of its hubris, and he played it with a commitment and a physical authority that the critics recognized as something different from what they had seen from him before. The film was extraordinary. It remains one of the definitive American films of the 1970s, a film about masculinity and violence and the specific horror of discovering that the assumptions you have organized your life around are inadequate to the actual world. Burt Reynolds was central to it. He was good in it. He was good in it in the way that actors are good in a role when the role asks them to produce something from a part of themselves that the rest of their work has not been asking for. He should have built his career on what Deliverance demonstrated. The films that followed Deliverance were not the films that Deliverance should have produced. They were comedies, action films, entertainment products of considerable commercial value and limited artistic ambition. Smokey and the Bandit in 1977, The Cannonball Run in 1981, Smokey and the Bandit 2 in 1980, Hooper in 1978, The Longest Yard in 1974. The films made enormous amounts of money. They made him the #1 box office star in the world, year after year, and the making of the money produced in him and in the people around him, and in the industry that was profiting from the money, a consensus that the formula was working and should be continued. The formula was working in every way except the way that mattered to him most, which was the way of the work itself. He has said, in the memoir and in the interviews of his later career, that he made too many bad films for the money and not enough good films for the art, and that the reason he made too many bad films for the money was that he was afraid. The fear was the fear of the man who does not fully believe in his own legitimacy as a serious artist, and who therefore accepts the commercial product because the commercial product is unambiguous and the serious work is not. The fear had a specific origin. The origin was his father. Burt Sr. had watched his son become the most famous entertainer in America, and had watched it with the specific quality of ambivalence of a man who had wanted something different for his son, and who found himself unable to fully celebrate what his son had actually become. The ambivalence was not hidden from the son. Burt Reynolds has described, in more than one context, conversations with his father, in which the father communicated, with the directness of a man who does not see the point of indirection, that what his son did for a living was not entirely what he considered real work, that it was entertainment, which the father placed in a category that was some distance below the categories he respected. This is the specific wound underneath the mustache and the charm. The son who had become the most commercially successful film actor in the world had become it in the only field available to him after the football scholarship and the knee injury. And the field was not the field his father had designed for him, and his father's inability to fully reconcile himself to it was something the son carried in the specific way that children carry their parents' unspoken disappointment, not as information that can be processed and set down, but as a permanent condition of the interior landscape. He married Lonnie Anderson in 1988. The marriage produced a son, Quentin, who was adopted. The relationship between Burt Reynolds and his son is the relationship that is, in retrospect, the most revealing thing about the specific quality of the damage he carried, because the relationship required of him the one thing the damage made most difficult, which was the capacity to be fully present for another person's need without the intermediation of performance. He tried. He tried in the way of a man who wants to be a better father than his own father was, and who understands intellectually what that requires, and who finds, in practice, that understanding and doing are separated by a distance that good intentions alone cannot close. The relationship with Quentin has been described in the accounts of both of them across the years of Quentin's growing up and into his adulthood, with the specific, careful language of people describing something that was real and complicated, and not as simple as either the failure or the success the biographies tend to offer as the only two options. The marriage to Lonnie Anderson ended in 1993, in one of the most publicly acrimonious divorces in the history of Hollywood celebrity culture, which is a culture that has produced acrimonious divorces of considerable spectacle. The divorce was covered with the specific quality of media attention that celebrities receive when the domestic arrangements that the public has been invited to admire are revealed to contain what the public has always suspected domestic arrangements contain, which is difficulty and resentment and the specific ugliness that emerges when two people who have been performing happiness for an audience are required to stop performing it. He did not manage the divorce well. He said things about Lonnie Anderson in interviews that he later acknowledged were cruel, and that he later, over years, came to understand as the expressions of a man who had not developed, across 60 years of living, adequate mechanisms for managing the specific combination of hurt and humiliation and the loss of control that the divorce produced. He said the things publicly because he had always managed his pain publicly, had always made the deflection and the joke and the self-deprecating comment the vehicle for whatever was actually happening inside, and the divorce did not provide material suitable for deflection, and the joke and the self-deprecation. And so what came out instead was the unmanaged version. And the unmanaged version was not kind. The bankruptcy came in 1996. He had been spending money throughout the peak years in the way of someone who does not fully believe the money is real, and who is therefore not able to manage it with the seriousness that money requires to be managed. The ranch in Jupiter, Florida, that he had built over years into the physical expression of the life he had imagined. Horses, land, the specific quality of southern outdoor life that his father would have recognized and respected, had been mortgaged and remortgaged and borrowed against until the borrowing could not be sustained. He lost the ranch. He lost the restaurant. He lost the specific collection of material things that had represented, more than the films or the celebrity, the life he had thought the success was for. And in losing them, he lost, or appeared to lose, the version of himself that the success had allowed him to maintain. The version of Burt Reynolds who was in control, who was doing well, who had converted the fame and the money into the tangible markers of a life that his father might have recognized as successful, even if the path that produced it was not the path his father had designed. The years between the bankruptcy and the career rehabilitation produced by Boogie Nights in 1997 were years that the biographies describe in terms that are carefully managed in their own way, terms that acknowledge the difficulty without dwelling in it, that note the professional decline without fully accounting for its interior dimensions. Paul Thomas Anderson cast him in Boogie Nights as Jack Horner, the pornographic film director who understands himself as a genuine artist using an undignified medium for legitimate artistic purposes. The casting was not accidental. Anderson had understood something about Burt Reynolds that the comedies and the Cannonball Run films had made invisible, which was that the quality of self-aware performance that the public persona required, the quality of a man who is always slightly commenting on himself even as he inhabits himself, was the precise quality that the character of Jack Horner required. Jack Horner is a man who has decided that what he does is art in the face of a world that has decided it is not, and the specific pathos of that position is the pathos of Burt Reynolds' actual relationship to his own career. He was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. He did not win. He lost to Robin Williams, who won for Good Will Hunting, and the loss was received by the people watching as something approaching a miscarriage because the nomination had felt like the beginning of a recognition that the decades had denied him, and the loss felt like a confirmation of the denial. He accepted the loss with the same grace with which he accepted most things publicly, which is to say with the charm and the ease and the self-deprecation, and with the specific quality of composure that a man develops when he has been managing his pain publicly for 40 years and has become very skilled at the management. What he said later about the loss, in the quieter contexts of the memoir and the later interviews, was more honest. He said that he had wanted the award with a seriousness that surprised him because he had spent a long time telling himself and others that the awards didn't matter and that the commercial success was what he was there for. And then the nomination arrived, and he found that the awards did matter, that they mattered in the specific way of things that have mattered all along and that you have been telling yourself don't matter, as a protection against the possibility of not receiving them. The industry that had made him the most commercially successful actor in the world from 1978 to 1982 did not, after Boogie Nights, organize itself to offer him the roles that the performance had demonstrated he was capable of. He made good films occasionally in the years following: The Longest Yard remake in 2005, The Last Movie Star in 2017, which stands as perhaps the most honest piece of work he ever did because it required him to play, essentially, himself at the end of a career. And he played it with a quality of undefended truth that the films of his peak years had not required. But the systematic recognition that the Boogie Nights nomination had suggested might be coming did not come in the form he had hoped for. He died on September the 7th, 2018, at the Jupiter Medical Center in Florida. He was 82 years old. The cause of death was cardiac arrest. He had been experiencing heart difficulties for several years and had undergone heart bypass surgery in 2009. He had continued to work through the difficulties, had continued to accept the parts that were offered, had continued to give the charm and the ease and the mustache to whatever occasion required them, until the heart stopped. The tributes were warm and genuine, and they focused, as tributes do, on the things that the public could access. The films, the Cosmo centerfold, the Trans Am, the Bandit, the specific quality of effortless cool that had defined an era. They mentioned Deliverance and Boogie Nights. They mentioned the marriages and the difficulties and the bankruptcy with the specific brevity that tributes give to the parts of a life that do not fit the tribute's preferred narrative. What they did not quite manage to say, what the tribute form is not designed to say, was the thing that the 2011 interview had gestured toward in the moment before the smile returned. The thing about having spent a long time being someone he thought people wanted him to be, and about figuring out who he actually was too late. I want to tell you what I think that meant, my friend, because I think it deserves more than the single sentence in a magazine interview that it received. He had wanted, from the beginning, to be the kind of man his father respected, the kind of man who was physically capable and professionally serious, and who built something tangible and lasting with his hands and his will. He had wanted to be the football player. When the football was taken away, he had constructed, with extraordinary commercial skill and genuine personal charm, the most successful version of himself that the available circumstances would permit. He had become Burt Reynolds, the most bankable star in the world, the man with the mustache and the grin and the Trans Am, the man who never seemed to take anything too seriously, the man whose ease was so complete that it appeared effortless and whose effortlessness was the most sustained and exhausting performance of his career. And underneath the performance, for the whole duration of it, was the thing the performance was designed to manage. The awareness that the man his father had wanted him to be was still the standard he was measuring himself against, and that the man he had actually become, the actor, the entertainer, the celebrity, the man who posed for Cosmopolitan and drove the Trans Am and made the Cannonball Run, did not quite meet that standard, and that no amount of commercial success or public adoration was going to change the standards equation. He told no one this. He told it approximately no one, which is the closest approximation of not telling anyone that a man of his degree of public visibility can manage. He told it in the 2011 interview to a journalist who did not notice he had told it. He told it in the memoir in the language that a man uses when he is writing about the things that shaped him, without quite being willing to say directly what the shaping produced. He performed the ease and the charm and the self-deprecation for 60 years because the performing was what he had, and the alternative, the unmanaged version, the version without the mustache and the joke, was the version that had no container, the version that could not be given to an audience because it was not a performance. It was simply a man, and simply a man was not something the world he had entered at 18 had any particular use for. He was, in spite of all of this, a person of genuine warmth, the quality of care he had for the people in his life, the friends, the colleagues, the people who worked for him over the decades, the people who had loved him when the money was there, and the people who had stayed when it was not, was real. And the people who received it consistently described it as one of the most reliable things about a man whose reliability in other respects was not always what it should have been. He loved with the openness of someone who understands that love is one of the few things he has always had access to, even when the other things were in question. He made The Last Movie Star in 2017, the year before he died. It is the film I keep returning to, my friend, when I think about what Burt Reynolds actually was and what the 60 years of performing Burt Reynolds cost him and gave him. The film, written and directed by Adam Rifkin, is about an aging action star named Vic Edwards, who has a name no one remembers anymore, and who travels to Nashville to accept a Lifetime Achievement Award from a small film festival he believes is larger than it is, and discovers on arrival that it is a tiny amateur event in a bar attended by almost no one, hosted by a young woman who only vaguely knows who he is. He plays Vic Edwards as a man who has nothing left to perform, who has lost the audience and the budget and the career, and who is therefore required, perhaps for the first time in his professional life, to simply be there without the performance. And what he puts on screen in that condition, the specific quality of undefended humanity that Vic Edwards in his final season contains, is something that no amount of professional calculation could have produced. It came from the same place that the 2011 interview came from, the place he had been managing around for 60 years, the place where the man was and not the performance. He was 81 years old when he made it. He had one more year. The film did not receive wide distribution. It was seen by a small number of people, which is what happens to small films about aging stars in a world that has moved on from both the star and the genre. The people who saw it generally agreed that it was the best work of his career. Whether the best work of a career should arrive in the penultimate year of the man's life, after 60 years of the commercial product and the formula and the charming deflection, is a question I am not going to answer for you, because the answer depends on what you believe a career is for and what you believe a life is for. And those are questions that each of us has to answer for ourselves. What I will tell you is that the man who gave that performance had been there all along, behind the mustache and the Trans Am and the Cosmopolitan centerfold and the Cannonball Run and the Smokey and the Bandit films and the Bankruptcy and the Acrimonious divorce and the comeback and the Academy Award nomination and the loss of the nomination. The man who said in a 2011 magazine interview, for one sentence before the smile came back, that he had spent a long time being someone he thought people wanted him to be, and that by the time he figured out who he actually was, a lot of things were already gone. He was there the whole time. He just couldn't find the moment earlier to stop performing him and simply be him. The world he worked in did not make that easy. The father he had wanted to impress did not make it easy. The persona he had built and the commercial machinery that depended on the persona did not make it easy. And by the time the conditions that made it easier arrived, the late career, the smaller budgets, the audiences that were not there anymore, the specific freedom of a man who has nothing left to lose commercially, by the time those conditions arrived, there was not much time left. He used what time there was well, I think. The memoir was honest. The Last Movie Star was honest. The interviews of the final decade had, increasingly and more consistently, the quality of a man who has decided that the performance is no longer worth the cost and who is finding in the honesty something that the performance had not provided. He died on a September morning in Florida, at the hospital in Jupiter, not far from the ranch he had lost. He was 82 years old. His son, Quentin, was with him. The mustache and the grin outlived the man, in the way that images outlive the people they are attached to. The Trans Am and the Bandit and the Cosmo centerfold are the things the culture keeps, the things that the anniversary articles reach for, the things that communicate Burt Reynolds to people who did not see Deliverance or Boogie Nights or The Last Movie Star. The things the culture does not keep as readily are harder to name and harder to fit in a headline. The man who spent 60 years performing the ease, the man whose father's standard he could never quite meet, the man who told a journalist in 2011 for one sentence before the smile came back, the truest thing about himself. I was being someone I thought people wanted me to be, and by the time I figured out who I actually was, a lot of things were already gone. Not all of them, Burt. Not all of them. Sleep well, my friend. And the next time you see that smile, in Deliverance, in Boogie Nights, in The Last Movie Star, In any of the moments where the smile is there but something behind it is not quite a smile, see what is behind it. You are looking at a man who carried something for 60 years without putting it down, who gave the world the charm and kept the wound, who performed the ease so completely and for so long that the world forgot, and he sometimes forgot, that it was a performance. He remembered, in the end. And in remembering, he gave us the truest thing he had.